Welcome everyone to our Homestead Exemption webinar. This is the next webinar in our series, and today we're going to cover a lot of information related to exemptions, including the general residence homestead exemption, the over 65 and disabled persons exemptions, and some other less common but equally important exemptions. So a lot of taxpayers still have not claimed their exemptions, and we want to make sure everyone's taking advantage of that very powerful tool that property owners have that can save some money on their taxes. So we want to make sure everyone who's eligible gets the exemptions and gets that benefit. During the webinar, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A feature. We have someone monitoring questions, and we'll also answer some questions at the end. All right, so let's get started. So what is an exemption? An exemption is just a deduction from your taxable value. So the taxable value of your property multiplied by your tax rate gives you how much you'll pay in taxes for each entity. And the state of Texas offers a variety of partial and complete exemptions. And we'll cover some of the more common ones today. But a property is always taxable unless it specifically says in law that it's not taxable. So all of these exemptions we're going to cover will provide you some kind of partial or complete exemption. And in most cases, an application is required to be able to get the exemption. And generally, those are due on April 30th. All exemptions can be either state mandated or local option. And for the most common general residence homestead exemption, the exemption is state mandated for school districts, meaning they're required by law to provide that exemption. So for school districts, it's a $25,000 state mandated exemption. And then for other types of entities, such as your city or your county, the homestead exemption can be a local option exemption, meaning that the taxing entities get to choose if they want to offer that to their residents. The general residence homestead exemption, again, is the most common exemption. This exemption is for owner-occupied residential property, and it can lower your taxable value of your school taxes. It lowers your taxable value by $25,000, which in turn lowers your school taxes. You may also hear at times something referred to as a homestead cap. So this cap with the general residence homestead limits the amount of the assessed value of your property to 10% per year. So it's important to understand that assessed value is not market value. Appraisal districts appraise property every year, and we're required to appraise at 100% of market value every year. And market value is what's happening in the market, what your property could sell for in any given year. But the assessed value is limited to last year's assessed value plus 10% or the market value, whichever is lower. So the market value and the market in Austin, as we all know, has been increasing, and we always have a very robust market. We do occasionally see a downturn. We saw it in the Great Recession during 2008 and 2009. And property owners at that time saw the market value as the lower of the two values. But generally, the Austin market is increasing. And so that cap really provides a huge benefit because it limits the assessed value to 10% per year. Other taxing entities can also approve a local option exemption. It is limited to 20% of the property's value. And again, it's elected or adopted by the taxing entities other than your school district. So for example, City of Austin and Travis County have both granted the maximum 20% exemption, and it's up to those local governing bodies to adopt the local option exemption. In order to qualify for the exemption, the property must be designed and adapted for human residence and be the principal place of residence. So the homeowner must own and occupy the property, and they cannot be claiming a homestead exemption on any other property. And that's within the state of Texas or any other state. You can only have one at a time. And then again, you have to file an application by April 30th in the year that you qualify. There's some exceptions, which we'll cover in a little bit, but generally file the application by April 30th. And there was a change this past legislative session. Generally, a property owner must own and occupy the residence on January 1st of the year to qualify. However, in some cases, you may be eligible to get a prorated exemption when you purchase the property as of that qualifying date. Some of those reasons that you might get the prorated exemption is if the property doesn't have an exemption on it as of January 1. So the seller or the prior owner didn't have any exemptions. And then you are not claiming an exemption on any other property on January 1. So the house you moved from, you didn't have a homestead exemption. And then you'll have to meet all of the other qualifications of the homestead exemption. And then if you meet those, you can have a prorated exemption amount. There's also an exemption for persons over the age of 65. And this exemption will lower the taxable value of your property by $10,000 for school districts. And again, the school district exemption is state mandated, it's required. The huge benefit of an over 65 exemption for school districts is that it establishes a tax ceiling, and that ceiling limits the amount of school taxes you pay from that point forward. So in the year you qualify, the year you turn 65, a tax ceiling is put on your school taxes, and you will never have to pay more than that amount in school taxes. They can go below that amount, but you'll never have to pay more than that. And since school taxes represent such a huge portion of your tax bill, it can be upwards of 50%. This becomes a really big benefit for persons over the age of 65. You can also transfer, or what they call port, that tax ceiling to another property. So if you move, you can transfer that ceiling to your new home. And again, this exemption is state mandated for school districts, but other entities can offer the exemption as a local option. So for taxing entities other than your school district, this is done by them adopting the exemption in a flat dollar amount. So for example, Travis County has adopted a $100,000 over 65 exemption, and City of Austin has adopted a $113,000 exemption. And that amount is taken off your taxable value and in turn reduces the amount of taxes you pay. Entities can also adopt a tax ceiling similar to school districts, which would limit your taxes. The only two entities that have taken advantage and adopted that local option tax ceiling is City of Cedar Park and City of Leander. And to qualify, you must be 65 years of age or older, and your property must be your principal place of residence. Again, you cannot claim this exemption on any other property, so you can only have one at a time. And if you're the surviving spouse of someone who is 65 years of age or older, you can also qualify and inherit this exemption from your spouse. You have to be at least 55 years old when your spouse passed away, and then your spouse had to have been receiving this exemption or would have qualified for that exemption in the year that they died. There's also an exemption for disabled persons, and it operates very similar to an over 65 exemption. Usually a property owner would qualify for this exemption if they were receiving SSI payments from the Social Security Administration. And like the over 65 exemption, the disabled persons exemption lowers the taxable value by $10,000. It also sets a tax ceiling for your school taxes. And this is for school districts as the state mandated exemption. And again, it operates just like the over 65 exemption. So taxing entities other than school districts can adopt a flat amount. So they can adopt the flat amount and a tax ceiling. Generally, taxing entities try to keep these in parity. So for instance, Travis County has adopted the $100,000 over 65 exemption and a disabled persons exemption. And then City of Austin has a $113,000 over 65 exemption and a disabled persons exemption. And then again, only the City of Cedar Park and City of Leander have opted to offer that tax ceiling. And then for entities that do offer a tax ceiling outside of school districts, you cannot transfer that to a new resident. So you can't port that tax ceiling. And then to qualify, you must have a medically determined physical or mental impairment. The impairment must prevent you from engaging in any substantial gainful activity. And that impairment must be expected to last for at least 12 months or result in death. And just like the over 65 exemption, the surviving spouse may qualify or inherit this exemption if they're at least 55 years old, 55 years of age or older when the spouse died, and the spouse was receiving this exemption when they passed away. For the over 65 and disabled persons, you can only get one or the other. So you can't claim both. If you were to be eligible for both, you would have to choose. As the taxpayer, you get a choice. And so you'll need to look into your taxing entities and determine what they're granting in terms of exemptions. Like I said, most keep them in parity, but there may be some cases where an entity offers a smaller amount for one or the other, and you would receive a larger benefit by electing to claim your disabled persons versus your over 65. We provide all of the information for the entities and which exemptions they have elected to opted in for on our website. You can research and determine which exemption you would want to choose, and it's on a per taxing unit basis. So you can select it for each entity that you pay taxes for. If you're a disabled veteran and you're 100% disabled, you can claim a 100% disabled veterans exemption. And this exempts the veteran from 100% of property taxes on their homestead. And that's all 100% of all taxes and for all taxing entities. To qualify for this exemption, you have to be receiving a 100% disability compensation, and it has to be due to a service-connected disability and have a 100% disability rating or an individual unemployability rating from the Department of Veterans Affairs. So the key here is it has to be a service-connected disability at 100%. And with the application, you have to provide the letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs as supporting documentation in order to get this exemption. And then surviving spouses can inherit this exemption. They have some special rules they have to follow, but they cannot be remarried, and they have to continue to own and occupy the property. And so the key here is it's 100% disabled with a service-connected disability to qualify. If you're a disabled veteran, but you are not 100% disabled, there is an exemption that is determined based on your percentage of service-connected disability. So you can apply this to your residence homestead, but this exemption can also apply to other properties. So if you own some land or a business, your disabled veteran exemption can apply to those properties as well. And this exemption is a smaller amount. It ranges from $5,000 to $12,000, depending on your disability rating. And to qualify, the veteran must be classified with the Veterans Administration as disabled with a service-connected disability of at least 10% or more. You have to be a veteran and you must be a Texas resident. And again, the surviving spouse can inherit this exemption as long as they have not remarried, and they also have to be a Texas resident. The surviving spouse of an armed services member killed in action or a first responder killed in the line of duty may also qualify for an exemption. And this is a 100% exemption from all taxes for all taxing entities. If a property owner has purchased any solar or wind powered energy devices, you could also qualify for an exemption. For this exemption, you must own the energy device. So lease systems are considered personal property and should not be taxed. But any systems you own, you could get an exemption for. The application for this exemption can be found on our website, and we also offer an online application that can be submitted, which is usually a little quicker. And then along with the application, we ask that you submit documents showing the installation date and the total output of the system. If the device was installed prior to when you purchased the property or it was included in the sale of your home, you could just include a statement to that effect. And then the online application and more details can be found on our website. It's www.traviscad.org/solar. And then the application deadline for this exemption is April 30th. And again, lease systems are considered personal property and shouldn't be taxed, but the appraisal district doesn't always know if it's a lease system. So If you see a solar or wind device on your notice of appraised value or on your account when looking online, you can email spex@tcadcentral.org and just let us know. You can include your address, property ID, and just a statement that the system is leased so we can get that removed from your account. And all of these exemptions, they require additional documentation along with the application. Those applications can all be found on our website, and many of them also have an online application that usually gets processed a little quicker. You'll complete the required application and then include copies of all required documents, and then submit those documents and application by April 30th. And then it is always free to file for an exemption. A lot of new homeowners get solicitations where someone will charge you $50 or $75 to file for that exemption. You don't have to pay someone to file for your exemption. It's free. The appraisal district can assist you with questions if you need help, but it's free. And many applications require the additional documentation. One big one is the Texas driver's license. So for your general residence homestead, you're required to send in a Texas driver's license or Texas ID card. And the address on your driver's license has to match the property address that you're requesting the exemption on. And then it has to be a Texas driver's license or ID card. We can't accept passports or any other form of ID, concealed carry licenses, nothing like that. It has to be the driver's license or ID. And then we get questions a lot about, what if my name's not on the deed? And this happens a lot with married couples. Just provide us some compelling evidence to establish ownership of the property. So some kind of paperwork showing that you're an owner. For the over 65 exemption, we need proof of age, so your driver's license or your birth certificate. For disabled persons exemption, we need proof of that disability. Most commonly, that comes from the Social Security Administration. For the disabled vet, you'll get a letter specifically from Veterans Administration that you'll provide with your application. And then for first responders, you can provide the letter from your employee's retirement system or ERS along with that application. If you're an heir property owner, you now have some additional requirements, but it allows you to claim a homestead on an heir property. And a lot of times the property has been in a family for a long time and that deed hasn't always been filed. So there's not clear ownership of the property. And so there was a law passed in 2019 that allows heir property owners to get an exemption. So to receive that homestead exemption on your heir property, you'll need to provide an affidavit establishing ownership and heirship, a copy of the prior owner's death certificate, a copy of the property's most recent utility bill, any available court records, and then an affidavit authorizing submission of the application. And that's just an affidavit from any other heirs stating that you are the occupant and you can claim the exemption. Some common concerns that we get from people and questions that we get a lot. If you have a married couple and both are on the deed, do both people have to sign the application? And no, they do not. Only one owner needs to sign the application. Now, if you're applying for the over 65 exemption and one spouse is turning 65, but the other isn't 65 yet, then that person turning 65 should sign the application. You can only receive one homestead exemption on one property in the same year. So you can't claim simultaneous exemptions. If you buy a new property during the year, you can only claim that exemption if it didn't have an exemption on your previous property. You can't have two. You may be eligible for multiple exemptions, so you can layer some of these on top of each other. So for example, you can claim your general residence homestead on your principal place of residence. And then on top of that, you could layer your over 65 or your disabled person. So you have to choose one or the other of those, but it would be in addition to your general residence homestead. Then if you qualify for one of the 100% exemptions, or the surviving spouse of one of those individuals, you could claim those exemptions in addition to your homestead. And in most cases, the exemption reflects the owner on January 1. So you may have the opportunity to file a late application. For example, general residence homestead exemptions, you have 2 years to file if you miss that April 30th deadline. And then for disabled veterans, you can go back up to 5 years and file for that late exemption. So there's still an opportunity for you to claim an exemption if you've missed that April 30th deadline. Generally, once you file for an exemption, you don't need to file it again. So there's not an annual requirement to file. Some exceptions to that is if a new deed is filed on your property. We see this a lot when someone puts a property into a trust. So if you put it into a trust or you're changing your name, updating or removing an owner, you would need to refile that exemption because the appraisal district has no way of knowing that that new deed is the same owner. And if you need more information or assistance, we have an exemption helpline. The number is 512-873-1560. And we have staff available Monday through Friday, 9 to 4:30. We also have some really good FAQs and more detailed information on our website. It's traviscad.org/homestead exemptions. And again, we offer an online application, which really speeds up the processing time. And we encourage everyone to file that online application. We get a lot of questions of how can we get involved? What can we do to affect our local taxes? And this year on May 7th, Texas voters will have the opportunity to vote to reduce their property taxes. There are 2 propositions on the May 7th election that can directly affect your tax bill. So Prop 1 is to provide some tax relief to property owners who are age 65 or older or disabled. Back in 2019, they reformulated the school funding formulas and school tax rates went down. We all saw that on our tax bills, but anyone who had an over 65 exemption and a tax ceiling didn't see a reduction in their taxes. So Prop 1 is just giving those individuals an opportunity to have their tax ceiling adjusted. And then Prop 2, and this is a big one, is to increase the school district homestead exemption from $25,000 to $40,000. And again, that's that state mandated tax exemption. So $25,000 to $40,000 for the homestead exemption. And then you can visit votetravis.com to check if you're registered to vote, find polling locations, and a lot of other information on the May 7th election. We encourage you to get involved and get out and vote on the May 7th election. And that's all we have on exemptions. Our next webinar is going to be on April 13th at 11:30. It's understanding your notice of appraised value. So we hope to see you all there. And we'll go ahead and check some of the questions and answers. So the first question, in order to get the homestead exemption, do I have to get a Texas license even though I'm in the military with PCS orders? And my state of residency has been Texas for years. There are some special exceptions for military. So if you have specific questions on what you need to do, just call into that helpline and we can tell you. The next question. If we purchased our home in March of 2021, could we apply for the prorated exemption, or does the prorated exemption option start in calendar year 2022? It would be for calendar year 2022. Since you purchased it in March of 2021, you would get the exemption on January 1st, 2022 anyways. So the proration starts January 1, 2022. How long does the online homestead application take to process, and how will I be notified with the successfully filed application? So it takes us about 60 to 90 days to process applications. The online application allows for online correspondence, so we can message you back if you're missing one of those required documents, or if you have questions. The easiest way to check and see if that exemption's been processed is to use our property search function. Once that homestead is granted, it'll show up on your account on property search. I'm waiting for my official driver's license with updated home address in the mail. Can I use the temporary driver's license? Yes, you can, as long as it has the address of the property. The seller of a property has an over 65 exemption and sells to a buyer that doesn't qualify for the same. Will TCAD automatically remove the exemption, even if the seller doesn't move it to another property? We do a homestead reset every year. So if you purchased a home in March of 2021, for 2022, it would be removed. For 2021, you would get the benefit of that prior owner's exemption as long as they didn't transfer it to their new property. Is there an office where this can be done in person, and can an appointment be made? Yes, our offices are still open by appointment only. So if you call the exemption helpline and they determine that you need to come in, you can set up an appointment with them. I'm new to Texas, and we have a new home constructed, will be completed in May 2022. How does that align with our exemption tax bill? So it would depend on a couple different things. If you didn't have a homestead exemption somewhere else, then you could qualify for the prorated exemption. Generally, January 1st is the day of that we consider for your exemption. So, but if you didn't have an exemption before, and obviously your new home didn't have an exemption from the previous owner, then you could qualify for the proration. And what tax year are we currently filling out the form for? So for this year's April 30th deadline, you would be filling it out for the 2022 tax year. But again, if you missed that deadline, you could also fill it out for 2021. Are we required to include our date of birth if we are under 65? Wondering for privacy issues. This is a great question. So date of birth is always confidential in our system. We don't share that information. So it's not required if you're just applying for a residence homestead exemption. However, if down the road you do qualify for that over 65 and we have a driver's license with a date of birth, it allows us to auto add your over 65. So you don't have to, we apply it before you have to apply for it. So it can help you there, but birth dates are always confidential. If we moved in on January 26, 2021, what should I file for? 2022? Yes, 2022, because you didn't own and occupy on January 1st of 2021, and that proration law didn't change until January 1st, 2022. My husband passed away a few years ago. It sounds like it would be best to update the deed before I file for exemption to avoid having to do it twice. I would file for it now. You want to get as much benefit as you can, and then file again if you update the ownership. Do I submit applications by April 30th if my house is not ready until May? So you can submit it early I think this is the new construction. So if you could qualify for that proration, you could go ahead and submit it in May when you move in and you own and occupy the residence. My house was originally as an investment property on my mortgage loan. Do I need to refinance to claim homestead? We don't deal with loans and loan origination, but we also don't consider that. You know, there's very specific requirements for the homestead exemption in the tax code. So as long as you meet those requirements, then you wouldn't need to refinance. For the changes in the homestead for 2022, if the property had the seller's previous exemption on as January 1, will that remain for the whole year as it has in the past? Generally, yes. So unless it's an over 65 and they port it to another property, that could change that. Or if there's any kind of proration, that could change that. But generally, yes, if there's no other event, then the seller's exemption would remain. Is our email address that we give on the form also kept private? If not, are we required to give you our email address? What benefit is there to giving you our email address? The email address, personal email addresses are confidential. If you're filling out a paper application, it's not required, although it does give us an easier way to notify you if we need some additional documentation or something like that. So there would be a benefit there, but it's confidential and it's not required by any means. My property is under an LLC. Can I still get an exemption? Yes, you can. As part of your supporting documentation, you would need to submit the LLC document showing that you're in the LLC as the primary person. Okay, I believe those are all of the questions for today. We encourage you to attend our next webinar, April 13th at 11:30, going over the notice of appraised value. So thank you all.